The heat was brutal, but it wasn't the sun that made Captain Bram Navarro sweat. The parrot's voice cut through the wind like a blade. He knew what you did. He knew what you did. And the girl, she never spoke. She just stared, barefoot, bruised, clinging to that iron cage like it held the last breath of her sanity. They'd found her drifting near the Mosquito Coast, alone in the wreckage of a Spanish sloop. No crew, no sails, just blood on the deck and a girl too young to remember her name. But the bird remembered everything. The crew joked about it at first. Ghost stories, they said. Old ship's parrots picking up strange phrases, harmless. Until Bram heard the words in his sleep. Until he remembered who else had said them. Once, long ago, before a blade silenced the truth forever in Port Royal. Now the voice wouldn't stop. Not the girl's, not the parrot's, not his own. The gold was cursed, yes, but it was my name, they screamed in the dark. You think pirate stories are just rum and treasure? Ask yourself this. What if a voice followed you that no one else could silence? What if it knew the one thing you swore to bury beneath the sea? And what if Blackbeard himself once warned, the ocean forgets no sin, only buries it deep? Welcome to the channel The Pirate's Diary. If tales of pirates, lost oaths and cursed gold stir something in you, the sea keeps its stories, but only for those who dare to remember. Will you join the crew? Subscribe and step aboard. The blade had shaken in Bram Navarro's hand just once, one heartbeat, one moment of doubt. Then the silence broke, a sound too soft for tavern walls, the wet gasp of a dying man. And the scar was born. It was 12 years ago, in the back room of La Dama Rota, a rotting tavern on the edge of Cartagena. The air stank of spilled rum and betrayal. The walls had seen too much. So had Bram. Solano hadn't fought. He looked up at Bram with those calm, storm-colored eyes. The eyes of a man who'd led him through tempests and mutinies, and said nothing. No curse, no forgiveness, just the sound of blood leaving the body that once saved Bram's life. He'd told himself it was justice. He needed to believe that. Corbin Drake had made it sound so simple. For what he did to your sister, he'd whispered. That was all it took. Bram had drowned the rest in rum and cannon fire and silence. But silence never lasts at sea, not when the parrot speaks. It came aboard the morning tide from a Spanish wreck near the Mosquito Coast, a black and emerald creature with cruel eyes and a voice like rusted iron. It belonged to no one, but it spoke endlessly, in perfect mimicry. He knew what you did, over and over, like a curse with feathers. At first the crew laughed, said it was just an echo. Old ships, old birds, strange things linger in the Caribbean air. But Bram froze the first time he heard it. The way the bird paused, like it understood, like it accused. Because someone had known, and Bram had made sure that someone died in Port Royal with a blade in his ribs. Only now, 12 years later, the voice returned, and this time it had wings. The sea doesn't forget, not truly. Bram tried to sail away from it, past the reefs of Maracaibo, through the fog of Tortuga. He even dropped the bird in a cage to the bottom of the Devil's Trench, thinking the pressure would crush the sound forever. But at night, the whisper still came. Not from the cage, not from a bird, from within. He knew what you did. He started to see Solano's eyes in the reflections of lantern glass, in the still water, in his dreams. And sometimes, worse, he heard his sister's voice, soft, choked, not in pain, but in warning. What if it had been a lie? What if Corbin Drake had used him? What if the justice he served was just another man's revenge? He returned to Cartagena, older, meaner, full of scars no surgeon could stitch. The tavern was still there, La Dama Rota, but everything else had changed. He found the barkeep rotting with disease and memories, and with one jug of rum and one whisper of Blackbeard's name, the truth began to spill. Solano had been watching over his sister, protecting her from someone far worse, someone tied to Corbin himself. The man Bram trusted had spun the story like silk, revenge disguised as justice. And Bram had slit the throat of the only man who never betrayed him. He collapsed that night beside the old docks, holding his face in calloused hands, drunk on rot and grief. And in the wind he swore he heard Blackbeard's voice, low, dry, like fire in ash. Gold can be stolen, ships can be burned, but trust dies only once. Bram carved a new mark into his arm, not to forget, but to remember. A wound to match the one inside. The scar still burns when the rain comes, still tightens when lies crawl back from the sea. Some say he's cursed, others say he walks with ghosts. But those who know him, the real ones, speak of a man haunted not by spirits, but by truth. He doesn't speak of Solano, but sometimes on nights when the wind howls and the sails crack like bones, Bram stares into the black horizon and whispers, "I killed my compass, and now I sail blind." The docks of New Providence stank of salt, sweat, and secrets. The sun was dying behind storm clouds, painting the harbor in rust and ash. Ropes creaked, gulls circled, and every sailor on the morning tide fell silent because he was already there. Blackbeard. He didn't walk. He arrived like thunder, like bad news, tall as a mast with smoke still curling from the slow-burning fuses in his braided beard. He moved like a man who'd outlived death itself. His eyes, cold, black, anchor-heavy, found Bram Navarro before a single word passed. "You carry something cursed, Navarro." No greeting, no question, just truth. Heavy, immediate, inescapable. Bram opened his mouth to lie, to brush it off with rum-soaked bravado. But the words stuck. Blackbeard didn't wait. He stepped, forward, slow, boots thudding like drums, and knelt beside the birdcage they'd brought ashore. The parrot tilted its head, silent now, watching. Blackbeard stared, closer than any man had dared, not at the bird, but at what lived behind its eyes. "Where did she find it?" His voice was low, scraped raw by years of storm air. Bram hesitated. His throat tightened. "A wreck," he said finally. "We found her drifting near the Mosquito Coast." A long silence, the kind that doesn't just hang in the air. It pulls at it, like gravity, like death. Then, "There are wrecks," Blackbeard said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that were meant to stay buried." He stood, turned, and walked away. No warning, no threat, because the warning had already come. That night, the harbor winds wouldn't sleep. Bram sat in his cabin aboard the morning tide, staring at the candle. The flame danced like a nervous memory. The bird didn't speak, neither did the girl. He turned to the pages of his journal, pages filled with false victories, hollow confessions, half-remembered sins, and there, slipped between the ink and the gilt, was a letter that hadn't been there before. One line, no name, no seal. The handwriting shook, like it was written by someone who wasn't supposed to be alive, or someone who hadn't stayed dead. "You killed the wrong man." Bram's stomach sank, not from fear, not from guilt, from recognition. Because deep down, behind the rum and the cannon fire and the years at sea, he'd always known. He hadn't watched Solano die for justice. He'd watched him die for someone else's revenge. The shadows grew longer in his mind. He saw again the way Solano looked at him, not angry, not surprised, just betrayed, like a father seeing his son raise the blade. Bram remembered Corbin Drake's words, "For what he did to your sister." But his sister had never spoken of it, never confirmed, never denied. She just looked away when Bram asked, looked broken, but not the way he thought. And now, Blackbeard was watching. The girl was silent. The parrot too, but the words burned all the same. "You killed the wrong man." The girl never said a word, not to Bram, not to the crew, not even to herself, in sleep. But her hands spoke, and what they revealed should have stayed sunken. She drew with salt and ash, with soot from the deck and rust from the cage. She scratched shapes into wood, into the mast, into her own arms when no one was looking. A crescent bay, a jagged reef, a broken tower swallowed by vines. Bram knew the shape too well. It was no sailor's dream, no child's madness. It was real, it was classified, and it haunted the back of his mind like a scream underwater. 12 years ago, Commander Solano had vanished into that island with only 5 men and a sealed order from the Spanish crown. No one came back but him, and even then he returned hollow-eyed, his sword rusted and his journals soaked with blood. He'd told Bram it was a failed patrol, a storm, a fever, a lie. Bram hadn't asked more, hadn't wanted to. There are truths you bury not because they're dangerous, but because they make you dangerous. But now, Isla was drawing it again, over and over, the island Solano had sworn never existed. One morning, Bram found her curled beneath the staircase, drawing into the wood with a nail pulled from a rotting crate. The detail made his stomach turn. She'd etched something new, a figure, buried to the neck, hands shaking, another man standing, above him, watching. And in the birdcage beside her, the parrot muttered, buried it with his hands. Watched it die. She saw. Bram stepped back, breath sharp in his chest, because he remembered now. That mission. He had helped Solano prepare the ship. Loaded crates without labels, sealed weapons he was told never to open. He wasn't supposed to ask. He was still young then, obedient, loyal. And when Solano returned without his crew, Bram didn't question the silence, didn't press. He trusted him, or maybe he was already learning to forget. That night, Bram sat in the captain's quarters with the birdcage covered, the candle low, and Isla asleep beneath the map table. He pored over his old journals, flipped past storms, raids, bloodshed. But there, tucked in the back, was a torn page he didn't remember writing, a sketched shoreline, that same crescent bay, and a single word beneath it, scrawled in faded ink, erase. Bram's hands began to shake. Had he been there? Had Solano taken him as a witness, as an accomplice? What had they buried together on that island? And why had Isla, a child who never met Solano, drawn it as if she'd watched from the trees? He tried to ask her, softly, kindly. Isla, who showed you this? She didn't speak, but her hand reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object, half-burned, blackened with sea rot. A locket. Inside, a painted face. Young, clean-shaven, wearing Spanish uniform. One of the 5 men who never came back. Bram's stomach twisted. The parrot, now uncovered, whispered again, slower, heavier, like the voice of something remembering. Watched it die, she never spoke. Not once. Not even when the crew shouted or the waves crashed or the parrot screamed. But Isla drew. With fingers caked in salt and grime, she carved shapes into wood, into the deck, even into her own arms when no one was watching. Lines, circles, a jagged reef, a crescent-shaped bay, a tower leaning like it was too tired to stand. At first, Bram thought it was nonsense, just madness in the shape of memory. But then he recognized it, not just an island, that island, the one from Solano's last mission, the final chart he'd ever touched before vanishing from the naval logs. Bram had believed the story then, a failed patrol. Nothing to see. But now, the shape of Isla's drawings clawed through that lie. She'd never met Solano, but she was drawing what he saw. The parrot muttered endlessly beside her, voice coarse like old rope, buried it with his hands, watched it die. She saw. Every time Bram heard it, the cold crawled deeper into his bones. He'd thought he buried guilt in Port Royal, but the sea always finds a way to spit things back up. What had Solano buried on that island? And worse, what had Bram helped erase? They found the island at dusk, no name, no chart, only shadow. The fog crawled from the jungle like it had teeth. It wrapped around the hull of the morning tide, scraping the wood with invisible claws. The crew stood frozen. Some wept, others muttered prayers to saints that never listened to men like them. Half refused to set foot on land. Those who did vanished by nightfall. No cries, no gunfire, just silence, like they were swallowed. Bram, Isla, and the parrot walked the shoreline alone. The sand was wet and black like it remembered every sin ever spilled there. Roots from the jungle twisted toward the sea like fingers reaching for mercy that never came. And then they saw it. The fortress, or what was left of it. Stone crumbled by storms, vines choking every doorway, a tower, just like in Isla's drawings, split clean down the middle like a scar in the earth. No birds, no insects, only breath, only dread. Inside, it was worse. Bram stepped over rusted sabers, shattered bottles, a skeleton still gripping a musket like it could keep the dark at bay. Then he saw it, half buried in the dirt, tucked beneath a fallen beam. A toy, a child's toy, wooden, hand-carved. He remembered it. His sister used to carry one just like it, and then the locket, tarnished, cracked open, still clinging to a rotted chain. Inside, the name scratched in delicate script, Lucia Navarro, his sister's name. Bram staggered back, breath shattered. His knees hit the stone. She had died of fever, hadn't she? That was the story, the one they'd told him, the one Solano had told him. But now the map was in Isla's eyes, and the truth was in the dirt. The parrot flapped once, perched on a fallen stone, whispered softer than ever before, watched it die, watched him lie. Bram stared at the locket in his trembling hand. What had Solano buried here? A body? A truth? What had Bram avenged with blood that maybe never needed avenging? The girl stood beside him, silent as always, but in the firelight that flickered from his lantern, he saw tears in her eyes. And for the first time, he didn't know whose grief they belonged to, hers or his own. The jungle waited. So did the truth. And somewhere deep beneath that fortress, beneath roots and ruin, something still breathed, something that once watched Lucia die, or live, or change. Bram didn't know anymore. Only that the sea had lied, and so had the men he trusted. In the distance, thunder rolled, not from the sky, from the sea. And Blackbeard's words echoed in his mind, not spoken aloud, but carried like salt in an old wound. There are wrecks that were meant to stay buried, but you went digging. The map was never ink on paper. It was carved in guilt, etched in memory, and drawn by the broken hands of those who remembered what they were never meant to see. And now Bram had followed it to the end. But some truths don't want to be found. Some stories rewrite the man who dares to remember them. Thunder cracked like cannon fire over the island. The sky split. The rain came down in sheets, soaking the fortress ruins, washing away footprints, names, lies. And Bram Navarro, once a captain, once a son, collapsed into the mud. He clutched the locket in both hands, shaking. His voice tore from him raw, shattered. She was mine. She was mine. But the earth didn't answer, only swallowed his cry. His knees bled against the stone. His coat clung to his skin. Rain mixed with dirt, salt, and something older, something that smelled like regret. The truth had a shape now. It wasn't a ghost. It was a girl. It was a child's toy. It was a whisper from a bird's beak. It was a name scratched into silver and left to rot in silence. Isla moved through the storm without a sound. She knelt beside him, her small hands dark with ash and rain, and then she opened her palm. Inside, a torn fragment of parchment, stained and trembling, folded tight, hidden deep inside the parrot's cage. Bram stared at it like it was a blade. She placed it on the wet stone before him, eyes steady. A confession, Solano's. The ink bled from age and water, but the words still struck like steel. I hid the girl, not because of guilt, but because of what she heard. The Admiralty fears what she knows, fears what they ordered. I swore to protect her. If I fall, let it be by a blade that believes in justice. Let it never know the truth. Bram read the lines twice, then again. His breath caught. His hands froze. Solano hadn't betrayed him, hadn't hurt Lucia. He'd saved her. She'd seen something she was never meant to see, not as a sister, not as a daughter, not as a child. She'd heard the Admiralty's whispers, the plans, the lies behind the war. She was a secret too dangerous to live. And Solano, the man Bram had killed, he'd hidden her, kept her safe, until Bram came with a knife and ended the only protection she had left. The betrayal wasn't Solano's, it was his own. The rain poured harder. It felt like punishment. Bram dropped the letter. His fingers twitched. His voice cracked as he spoke. Not to Isla, not to the parrot, not to the sky, but to the man he had killed. I thought I was avenging her. His throat burned. I thought you let her die. But now he knew. He was the one who let her be forgotten. He was the blade they used. And everything since, the rum, the blood, the storms, had just been silence trying to scream. Isla placed a hand on his arm. Just a touch. Nothing more. But it held the weight of the sea. And in that moment, Bram saw her. Not as a strange girl, not as a survivor, but as the last witness. The final thread of a truth that had been drowned and buried, torn and burned, but not erased. And the parrot. It watched from a branch of twisted stone, its feathers slick, its eyes black as midnight water. He knew what you did, it said quietly. But this time, it wasn't a curse. It was grief. Bram didn't move for a long time, not even when the wind shifted, or the lightning flashed, or the jungle began to stir. He stayed kneeling, soaked in rain and memory, holding the locket in one hand and the confession in the other. The war he'd fought wasn't over territory or gold or freedom. It had always been over truth, and truth, as Blackbeard once warned him, is the storm no ship can outrun. Now, when sailors speak of the morning tide, they say the captain changed that night. He no longer chased treasure. He no longer feared death. He searched only for wrecks left off the maps, for graves that never got stones, for voices buried under orders and silence. And some say, he's still searching. The storm had passed, but the silence it left behind was heavier than thunder. Bram stood in the ruins of the fortress, soaked to the bone, every breath a battle. The jungle no longer whispered. Even the wind held its tongue. And the parrot finally spoke again. Not like before, not with venom or mockery, but like memory itself, shaken loose from rotted stone. He buried her for her safety. The words echoed off the walls like footsteps from the past. Bram turned, slow, his heart pounding in his chest like the drums of war. The Parrot sat calmly now, its eyes fixed not on Isla, but on him. "They'll come for her soul." The voice was Solano's. Not perfectly, but close enough to reopen wounds Bram thought had already bled dry. These weren't random phrases, not tricks of mimicry. They were truths, words spoken in solitude, in desperation, in fear, spoken by a man who lived with the weight of betrayal every single day, but not his own. The bird had been trained here, in this very place, long before Bram spilled Solano's blood in a tavern backroom. While the rest of the world forgot the girl, Solano had remembered, protected, spoken to her when no one else would. And the bird had listened. All those cryptic phrases, the repetitions, the whispers that followed Bram across the sea, they weren't curses, they weren't hauntings, they were the truth, repeated over and over, hoping someone might finally hear them. Bram's knees gave out. He dropped beside the overgrown stones, hands shaking, his throat clenched like it was strangled by a decade of lies. He had killed the only man who stood against the Admiralty's order, the only man who had hidden Lucia, who had loved her like a daughter. He'd buried that love beneath fury. He'd fed it to fire and rum. And now Isla, the girl who never spoke, who carried drawings like scars, who watched the sea with eyes that knew too much, stood before him. Not just a survivor, his niece. She had crossed oceans through storm and hunger, death and silence, to find him, not to reunite, not to forgive, to deliver something, not vengeance, not hate, judgment. Bram looked at her and saw Lucia, the shape of her face, the strength in her silence, the pain she never named, and he saw himself, the boy who had trusted lies over love, the captain who turned his back on truth, the man who killed the wrong person, then buried the guilt beneath a flag soaked in sin. He tried to speak, but no words came, just the parrot, soft, measured. He loved her like his own. He died keeping his promise. The fortress wasn't just ruins now, it was a grave of loyalty, of truth, of a man Bram should have called brother, not traitor. And Isla, she had carried the truth across the sea, not with fury, but with quiet strength. She was the storm's last breath, the memory that wouldn't drown, the echo of a name no longer whispered but remembered. Some stories end in gunfire, some in gold, but this one ends in silence, and in that silence, Bram Navarro finally understood. He hadn't been cursed, he had been trusted, and he had failed. Now all that remained was what he chose to do with the truth that survived him, because the sea forgets many things, but not the words of a dying man, not the eyes of a child who remembers, and not the sound of a parrot repeating the sins of a captain who can no longer run. He came with the fog, before the sun, before the birds, before the jungle even remembered to breathe. Corbin Drake. But this wasn't a man anymore. It was something that had crawled out of the grave and stolen its own skin back. His coat hung loose over bones. His face was a map of rot. Eyes sunken, yellow, twitching with the hunger of unfinished business. He looked like he'd been drowned twice and still refused to stay under. Bram felt it before he saw him, the shift in the air, the sudden cold that crawled beneath the skin. And when Corbin stepped from the mist, boots dragging in the wet soil, Bram knew. The past had come to collect. Corbin's voice cracked like brittle wood. "You always protect the wrong people." He smiled, or tried to. It looked more like pain. Or maybe he'd forgotten how to smile and only remembered how to sneer. Behind Bram, Isla stood frozen. The bird flapped once, then fell silent. Corbin's eyes locked on the girl. "She saw it," he hissed. "She knows where they hid the treasure." But it was never about gold. Not truly. Bram felt it now. The way Corbin stared, not like a thief chasing coin, but like a butcher making sure the last witness doesn't crawl out of the dark. "You think this is about coin?" Bram's voice was low, steady. Corbin stepped closer. Rain dripped from the trees like slow tears. "No," Corbin whispered. "It's about silence. That's always been the game." He hadn't aged, not in the way men do. He'd decayed. Whatever soul Corbin once had been sold long ago, not for treasure, but for erasure. To remove people, to bury names, to cut out pages from history and salt the ground. Where truth once stood, Bram remembered now. The promises, the whispers, the lies stitched into justice. "For what he did to your sister," Corbin had once said, and Bram had believed him. Now he knew the truth. Corbin had used him like a dagger in someone else's hand. And now he wanted Isla, not because she was family, but because she remembered what she shouldn't. She knew what the Admiralty had done. She heard the plans behind closed doors. She survived what was meant to be erased. Bram stepped in front of her. No words, just movement, just breath, just the space between past and present. Corbin tilted his head, amused. "Still trying to be the hero, Bram?" He clicked his tongue. "You've got the habit of standing in the way of bullets meant for better men." Bram didn't flinch. His hand moved to the hilt of his blade. "You were the lie," Bram said quietly. "Solano was the truth." The rain fell harder now. The jungle held its breath. Corbin's hand brushed the inside of his coat. Slow, casual, like he had all the time in the world to kill them both. And Bram drew steel. The sound was clean, the scrape of old metal meeting air, a sound that belonged to death, to reckoning, to endings written in blood and rain. The parrot squawked once, sharp, final. Corbin's smirk faded. What came next would not be for gold, not for vengeance, but for remembrance. Because Isla had carried the truth across the sea, because Solano had died keeping a promise, because Bram had finally learned what side of the blade he'd always been on. The rain returned, cold and heavy, as if the sky itself was trying to drown the memory of what had just risen from the fog. Bram stood with his blade drawn, breath shallow, soaked to the bone. Before him, Corbin Drake moved like rot-made flesh, slow, deliberate, savoring every step like it was a ritual. Behind them, the jungle loomed. Around them, only ruin. Stone fractured by time, vines like veins crawling across forgotten walls. This wasn't a duel, it was a reckoning, and it had waited years. The fortress remembered, the jungle listened, and the dead held their silence. They didn't speak. The time for words had died in a backroom 12 years ago, where Bram's blade had carved justice out of a lie. Now only steel. It struck like thunder. Sparks burst in the rain. Each blow carried a weight that had nothing to do with muscle. It was guilt that swung the sword. It was shame that parried. It was rage that pressed forward. And blood, thick, dark, hot, began to mix with the mud beneath their feet. Bram slipped once, but the voice of the parrot cut through the storm. He buried her for her safety. He loved her like his own. Isla stood behind the bird, soaked and pale, hands clenched, watching with the eyes of someone far too young to carry this much pain. And the parrot, the cursed witness, the last echo of Solano's love, screamed, but not in mimicry. This scream was something else, something primal, something that no child should have ever heard. It shook the walls, it startled the jungle, it made even the rain falter. Bram struck deep, once, twice, and then the blade found its home, buried clean into Corbin's throat. The old man staggered back, knees buckling, hands trembling, as if the lies he carried could no longer hold him up. He fell onto the stone with a wet sound. The rain pooled around him like ink, and he smiled. That same smirk Bram remembered from the beginning, the one Corbin wore when he whispered poison into his ear. Blood spilled from his lips, thick and dark, but the voice came out clear. "You're too late." He coughed once, laughed once. "They're already coming." Then he went still. Not peaceful, just empty. The storm didn't stop. It pressed down like a hand on their shoulders, but the silence after Corbin's final breath was louder than the thunder had ever been. Bram stood over the body, sword dripping. He didn't move, didn't speak, because the truth didn't feel like victory. It felt like weight. The jungle knew, the fortress knew, and now Isla knew that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something darker, something bigger, because Corbin was never the head of the beast. He was just the hand that pulled the blade. And now they were coming. A single grave stood on the edge of the island, marked only by a compass. No name, no date, just rusted brass and the sound of waves clawing at the shore. The jungle was quiet now, but not peaceful. Ash floated in the air, soft as snow. Somewhere beyond the fog, the charred bones of the morning tide groaned as the tide pulled it deeper into the reef. Nothing left to sail, nothing left to chase. Bram sat in the sand like a man already buried, his arms wrapped around Isla, who slept with her head pressed to his chest, a heartbeat she didn't trust, but still listened to. The parrot sat on his shoulder, soaked and silent. 3 days after Corbin's death, Blackbeard arrived. No cannon fire, no sails of terror. Just a shadow stepping from the fog with the weight of the sea on his back. His beard still smoked, his coat dripped with rain and time, and in his eyes was the look of someone who had seen too many endings and buried too many names. He said nothing at first, just looked at Bram, the man who had once wanted revenge, and ended up drowning in it. Then quietly, "She's your blood." Bram nodded. He didn't cry. Not anymore. There was nothing left in him to shed. Blackbeard knelt beside the grave, ran a hand over the compass like it was something holy. "And this is your punishment." Bram pulled the journal from his coat. Pages soaked, edges torn, a lifetime of lies, confessions, rage, and salt. "Burn it," he said, placing it in Blackbeard's hands. "Or let someone read it, I don't care anymore." The old pirate didn't flinch. He lit his pipe with a coal he kept dry in a silver locket. Smoke curled between them like the ghosts of everything they'd both lost. "The sea remembers Bram," Blackbeard murmured, "and the sea never forgets." As the fog closed around the shoreline and Blackbeard's longboat faded into mist, the parrot leaned close to Bram's ear, and for the last time it spoke. Not loud, not mocking, just truth. "He knew what you did. And Bram," he finally listened, "the grave will vanish one day, swallowed by vines, storms, or men who build on top of stories they never understood. But somewhere, in every ruined chart, every missing page, every silence between cannon blasts, this story lingers. Not about gold, not even about betrayal, about the face of a man who thought he was doing the right thing until it was too late to take the blade back." Isla would grow. She would carry that silence like a shadow stitched to her heels. Bram would never be whole again, not after realizing the worst betrayal wasn't what Solano did. It was what he believed. Some say Blackbeard still sails near that island, not for treasure, not for fame, but to guard the place where truth died and tried to rise again. They say when the wind shifts, you can hear his voice in the waves. He warned us. We didn't listen, and now he's part of every wave that crashes in silence. Did you already know this forgotten part of the story? If you had been on that island, would you have drawn your sword or listened first? What other sea stories deserve to be remembered, no matter how painful they are? If this story touched you in any way, don't let it vanish. Like so many other names the sea has taken, Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to keep hearing what was never meant to be forgotten. This was the Pirate's Diary. Another page closed, another secret swallowed. But some wounds never stop bleeding when the tide comes in.